when exactly did Dickens live in Doughty Street?
Well, he moved in March, April 1837 and stayed here for the best part of 3 years, so they moved out in December 1839. He moved in here with his wife Catherine and their 2-year-old son Charlie. Yeah, they had 2 daughters, Mary and Katie, while they were living here.
And how significant is the house in Dickens's life and also his writing?
Well, I think in his life he moved here really at a time when he was beginning to make a name as a writer through sketches by Boswell, particularly the Pickwick Papers, which he finished off in this house through their serialisations. So it was really a time when he had the confidence to come and rent this house, although it was £80 a year, but was very much a kind of aspirational middle-class area. As far as his writing, he would have written a lot about it in his letters and correspondence. He was obviously a bit overwhelmed actually by moving here, because he writes about the awful responsibilities of his new house. And in terms of his novels, this area is very much surrounded by different Inns of Court, like Lincoln's Inn, particularly Gray's Inn, and those are always a constant theme in Dickens's writing in novels like Bleak House. Round the area, although this was a up-and-coming area, there were rough areas nearby, like you still get in London really. So Saffron Hill, just the other side of Gray's Inn Road, was the area where Fagin's Den in Oliver Twist was set. And Dickens's preferred style was Regency, so quite flamboyant, quite kind of dandyish and very fashionable of its time.
He's a very flamboyant man. What are the most popular items in the house?
We have a very well-known painting here called Dickens' Dream by a painter called Robert William Buss. So he was moved to do this painting after Dickens's death in 1870, and it depicts Dickens sitting in his study at Gad's Hill in Kent, which is the house he lived in for the last 10 years of his life, at a desk and chair which we have in the museum. And really the intention was that Dickens was asleep and he was surrounded by all these characters from his novels and characters that he was dreaming up. But the irony actually is that Buss himself died in 1875 before he'd finished it, and so part of its charm is that some of it is still left uncoloured. I mentioned we have a desk and chair that Dickens had. He did buy it when he was still in London actually, but then it was in his house in Kent the last 10 years of his life. So although he wrote in a chalet in his gardens in the good months, in the colder months of the year, he would have written at this desk. So he would have written novels like Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend, at this desk and chair. I particularly like a couple of photographs. There was Dickens was involved in a train crash in Kent, Staplehurst, 5 years before he died in 1865, and there are photographs of this train crash which are fascinating. And it's also fascinating because actually photography was only really invented in 1839, the year that Dickens left this house, and so as well as it being interesting from Dickens's life, it's also interesting just to see how quickly something like photography had developed.
And what impact do you think the house and the museum have had on the generations since Dickens?
Well, hopefully, I mean, our aim really is to encourage people to appreciate Dickens's work, to build their own knowledge of history and his life, and perhaps the times that he was living in as well. Perhaps they'll be inspired themselves to write, or if not, study literature, study history, interpret Dickens and his works for as wide an audience as possible, and hopefully to educate and inspire them.
Has the museum helped people see Dickens as a man and his life as a whole, rather than just the esteemed literary great?
And I hope we portray both, really. Obviously, Dickens's writing, his novels, and his other writing of short stories, correspondence, plays. We hope that we obviously portray those through the house. But yeah, we'd also like people to get an insight into him and his family and some of his friends. Dickens first went to America in 1842. His friend Daniel Maclise did a piece of art of his depicting his children and their pet raven, Grip, and the reason for that was to give it to Dickens and his wife so that they wouldn't miss them so much when they were on their trip, and it was a way of slightly persuading his wife to go with him, I think, on this trip to America.
With the death of his sister-in-law Mary, would that have been the most important?
It's certainly one of the most important events in Dickens's life. Mary, they went to the theatre actually, and just about 2 or 3 months after they'd moved into this house, Mary was only 17, and she died of what I think looks like heart failure. And Dickens was incredibly fond of her, as of course was Catherine. So it certainly had a big impact on them. Catherine miscarried. They went to recuperate in Hampstead, which at that time was almost a kind of country retreat, really. And it was one of the few times when Dickens would have taken a break from writing, and he was writing Oliver Twist at the time, and actually missed instalments in it. Very, very unusual for him. And in his later life as well. I mean, certainly there are tales of him, having vivid dreams about Mary, and in some of his writing as well, whether perhaps there's a sickness or death of young, innocent female characters. Most famous, I suppose, being Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop. People often think that was Dickens drawing on his, terrible experience of losing.
And how did the family live?
Well, they had 3 servants here. Actually, it's quite strange now when you look at look at a house, which it's a lovely house. It's not a huge house, and a nurse had looked after the children, a cook and a maid. Dickens had a groom as well, although he would have lived off-site. Dickens tended to spend the mornings writing in his study, and Catherine would have spent mornings mostly in the morning room, where she would have been perhaps tending with the children or looking after kind of household affairs. She was also gifted needleworker as well, actually, so occasionally would have had visitors in the morning room. But certainly they were great entertainers as well. Dickens loved to entertain, so lots and lots of stories of him entertaining various friends and business associates here. The dining room here is set up for 6 people, and it looks like it would accommodate 6 people, but there are stories that once there were 14 people that they managed to accommodate in the dining room. So he obviously loved to entertain. And in the drawing room as well here, they would have entertained visitors after the meal. As I mentioned earlier, Dickens was a great actor and performer, so he would have done readings or performed small plays. There's stories of him doing magic lantern tricks and magic tricks as well, and also loved organising parties for children as well.
There have been a great many films about Dickens, and you mentioned An Invisible Woman on your website, and I was just wondering, have any of these films used the house?
We had John Coleshell here last week, who was talking about Nicholas Nickleby and did some filming in the museum. I asked my colleagues actually, and before I started, the Clint Eastwood film Hereafter actually did some filming in the house that was used in the film, so Clint Eastwood and Matt Damon were here in 2010.
And finally, what would Dickens think of the Pigeonhole?
Dickens, as most people know, serialised his novels in weekly or monthly parts, and the reason for that really was it was cheaper, and it brought a much wider readership from, rather than just producing things in what were then quite expensive books, really only affordable to a few. So I think the idea of being able to publish something that's very cheap, very accessible, comes out in these instalments or staves, I think would have really appealed to him.